Ilko.
Neploch kilkam. Kalkot.
Ahul Uchpeng.
Haja, Uchvaster, Dos.
Joch kilkam.
Jo. He. Pa. Wa. Ba. Honol. Pa. Ba. Pa. Goose. Upjaw.
Haja. Jochi. Neploch kilkam. Joch. Neploch.
Al. Goose Peng. Suba.
Haja, Utsula for Yikla.
Ooh.
We are a medical facility. I repeat, we are a medical facility. Do not engage!
Kilkam.
We have women and children.
Oh,
Please, this is a medical
Gotland.
facility. We have women and children. Please do not engage!
Ah!
Hold your fire! We surrender!
For over 7 generations, the people of Septimus III have led a quiet existence, bathed by the light of their young star and the stellar radiation of the Badlands, making their living off of farming and modest trade. Over the years, the land has become a rolling expanse of vineyards and orchards, growing the sweet, sugary fruits that make the famous carnage. It is the 10th of September, 2375, a day like any other. Even as the Allies invade the neighbouring system of Chinta, the war still feels far away. Even for the garrison troops of the 11th Order is more like a game, launching raids into the Chinta system at their leisure, as if going on a Regnar hunt, in much the same way that the conscripts play hoop ball with the local children, or the young officers play blind man's buff with the harlots. For now, Septimus III sleeps, lost in a sweet dream, yet soon it will awake to the true reality of war. Only one man in this small, insignificant planet understands the true nature of war, a man whose name stands in infamy, one who has committed crimes so heinous he is said to be cursed, the Beast of Bthar, the Butcher of Elardrel, Legate SoBrag. It is his name alone that will turn Septimus III from a strategically insignificant world on the Cardassian border to the bloodiest battleground yet seen in the annals of warfare. Legate SoBrag first came on the Allies' radar during the Calandra offensive, where he was assigned to crush Klingon resistance in the Volterra pocket, an assignment he took to with ruthless efficiency, cutting down many of the Empire's greatest warriors one by one in dishonorable Kuk-Chu battles. Many Klingons were keen to avenge this dishonor, yet the Klingons were merely SoBrag's latest enemy in a long line, first of which were the Bajorans. During the occupation, SoBrag had been in command of the Bthar labor camp. Under his authority, thousands of Bajorans were beaten, starved, and executed, many of which he handled personally, famously beating a father to death in front of his screaming family. He was perhaps the most hated Cardassian on all of Bajor. In the years following the occupation, the newly formed Bajoran Intelligence Bureau made a concerted effort to track down and monitor all Cardassian officers involved in the occupation, in the hopes of one day being able to enact justice. But SoBrag was cunning. Throughout his career, he maintained close ties to the Obsidian Order, who worked to frustrate the Bajorans' attempts to track him, and at the outbreak of war, he was able to move freely about the front, thanks to the Bajorans' non-aggression pact with the Dominion. It was only after the Romulans joined the war that SoBrag's shroud of protection began to falter, with the Tal Shiar's counterintelligence operations one by one removing those who had kept SoBrag hidden, leaving him with no friends, and before long, nowhere to hide. SoBrag, like many officers of the Old Guard, was fully aware that his Dominion allies held him and many others like him in disdain. If the Dominion got the chance, they would gladly cut SoBrag loose and leave him for the wolves. And so hitherto, SoBrag had been incredibly cautious, making sure to follow behind more favoured officers, securing garrisons and crushing pockets of resistance, with the Dominion's best and brightest between him and his foes. While this caution kept SoBrag safe, it also meant he was unable to claim military glory, and thus lost him even more prestige.
2 decades ago, SoBrag was one of Cardassia's finest. Driven, efficient, and ready to get his hands dirty. Back then these virtues were applauded, but after the Dominion came in, it was all about public image and spin. He was a relic of another era, one they'd prefer everyone forgot.
When the Allies invaded the Chinta system in January of 2375, SoBrag saw his opportunity to regain prestige among his fellow Cardassians and show up his Dominion allies. Moving quickly, he managed to obtain permission from Legate Damar to take command of Jem'Hadar fleet groups Gamma 2 and Alpha 12 surrounding the Chinta system. And over the following 8 months, he launched numerous raids against the Allied positions, each time escaping with impunity. On the 20th of May, SoBrag led a raid personally from the attack cruiser Yakar, supported by Sartan frigates. His goal was to intercept and destroy the outbound medical transports, the USS Ekaterina and USS Perth, along with several other vessels. Able to exploit the flaws in their own defences, the Cardassians were able to close to 3 AU of the system at low warp, before accelerating to maximum warp for their final approach, dropping out of warp practically on top of the convoy. With most warships spread thin across the system, only a handful of ships were able to respond, including the IKS Pachar, commanded by Drex, son of Martok. While heavily outgunned, Drex did not hesitate, rushing to the defense of the convoy, though to no avail, as Drex's squadron was largely disregarded as SoBrag focused solely on the defenseless transports. Only after destroying the Ekaterina and Perth did SoBrag turn his attention to the birds of prey, casually disabling them with just a few shots, leaving Drex disabled and dishonoured. However, Charlie Reynolds of the USS Centaur was rapidly closing on the raiders. SoBrag's disregard of the Klingons had resulted in his ship taking heavy damage, forcing him to withdraw. Rather than give chase, Reynolds instead stopped to provide aid to his Klingon allies, a selfless and noble gesture, which nonetheless allowed SoBrag to escape. Nor would this be the last time SoBrag used his enemy's nobility against them, as the Allies advanced on Chinta 3 and 4, taking more and more territory, and with it more and more settlements. It provided the Cardassians with an opportunity to use their own population as cover, hiding among the civilian populace and carrying out hit-and-run attacks intended to demoralize the Allied forces and provoke a reaction. While Admiral Ross was able to restrain his allies, many Klingons and Romulans were soon itching for some payback, and when the opportunity came, they wouldn't be picky. By August, it had become clear to Allied High Command that if they wished to make further gains into Cardassian territory, they would first have to remove SoBrag from the field. In the last 6 months alone, SoBrag had dealt each one of the Allies humiliating losses. In order to do so, they would have to first find SoBrag. While it was logical to assume that he would be commanding his forces from one of the 4 systems adjacent to Chinta, there was no way of knowing exactly which of the 4 he was using as his base. With most of Allied intelligence focused on monitoring Dominion strategic developments and maintaining their own security, there were few resources allocated to tracking down enemy commanders. However, Bajoran intelligence had both the resources and knowledge to track down SoBrag. Given the atrocities he had perpetrated, they were more than happy to share that information with the Allies. For the first time in their history, the Bajorans had the power to punish those who had wronged them. On the 25th of August, Glyn Marep of the 11th Order noticed significant activity in one of the coastal villas on Septimus III. His unit had already been based there for 6 months, so it was unlikely to be any of their officers moving in. And when he approached the property to inquire, he was turned away by Jem'Hadar guards. Marep had previously been a member of the dissident movement. As a dissident, he had had some contact with Bajoran intelligence, although he made it policy not to give up information that might compromise his own unit. However, he was more than happy to work to undermine the Dominion. He reported this disturbance to his contact. Intrigued by the potential opportunity, they sent a signal to confirm. However, he never responded, and a few days later his body was suddenly found on a riverbank. This was in itself considered confirmation, and Bajoran intelligence quickly passed this information on to Admiral Ross of Allied High Command. Time was of the essence. It wouldn't be long before SoBrag would slip away again. Keen to seize the opportunity and avenge the dishonor of his son, General Martok offered to lead the attack on Septimus III. He was supported in this by Chancellor Gowron, who sent him reinforcements to bolster the now depleted ranks of the Klingon Expeditionary Force, including the new Chrono-class destroyers and over 30,000 freshly raised ground troops. What they lacked in training and professionalism, they would surely make up for in their ferocity. In only 14 days, Martok's Klingon Expeditionary Force was once again mobilized and ready to move. They would be joined by the Federation 19th Fleet, who would form a perimeter around the system to prevent SoBrag's escape and halt any counterattacks. Holding the Septimus system was the 11th Order, an otherwise unremarkable unit. Due to the defensive nature of its deployment, it had seen several of its key combat assets, including assault, artillery, and carrier lines reallocated to elsewhere on the front, along with their best troops, leaving it undermanned and under tonnage. SoBrag had realized this and had given orders that in the event of an attempted breakout, the neighboring Jem'Hadar Fleet Group Gamma 2 should reinforce them. However, only Dominion High Command on Cardassia Prime actually had the authority to give that order, leaving the 11th at the mercy of Dominion whims. On the 12th of September, 2375, General Martok launched his attack, with his birds of prey revealing the lack of Cardassian heavy assets and any fortifications. He gave the order for a Chen Mo style attack. At 2:41, the entire Klingon fleet decloaked simultaneously and began attacking targets at will. With the Cardassians so outgunned, there was no need to attack in phases. Rather, they would simply overwhelm them as the Votchers and Krons immediately opened up on the few Cardassian cruisers, while the birds of prey worked to break up their formations. At the same time, Katingas and D-10s opened fire on surface targets while simultaneously launching assault shuttles to begin landing on the planet. By employing these seemingly chaotic tactics, the Klingons were able to overwhelm the highly regimented Cardassian command and control structure, overwhelming all the key decision makers and preventing any effective coordination. While the 11th Order did have enough ships to make a fight of it, they were too dispersed and unable to find a rally point, the various divisions constantly harassed and corralled by swarms of birds of prey, while the Krons and Votcha moved through, picking off Cardassian cruisers one by one, leaving the smaller starships exposed and unsupported. This carnage was mirrored on the surface of Septimus III, as the Lance and Disruptor bombardment drove all Cardassian troops to ground, unable to oppose the Klingon landings, as soldier and civilian alike hunkered down in underground bunkers, waiting and hoping for the bombardment to stop, or for relief to arrive. Jem'Hadar Fleet Group Gamma 2 was based in the neighbouring Omekla system, and was only 12 hours away at maximum warp. Almost immediately after the Klingons' attack, the garrison had sent out a distress call, which reached Cardassia Prime at 0442. Despite this, Fleet Group Gamma 2 did not receive any orders to relieve the Cardassians. If the Jem'Hadar had come to the Cardassians' aid, they would have likely caught the Klingons in a compromised position, their brigades scattered across the system in pursuit of the Cardassian fleet, which held out for 16 hours until it became clear that no help was coming. At this point, the Cardassians scuttled and abandoned their ships, surrendering to the Klingons, who did not take kindly to such cowardice.
We were beamed out of our escape pods, arriving at gunpoint on the transporter pad. They were about as rough as we expected them to be. We thought they were taking us to the brig, but instead they led us to the cargo bay. It didn't take long for us to realize what was going to happen to us. They had us lined up against the bulkhead and started pulling out the officers from our ranks. They lined them up in front of us, and with daggers and cleavers and bat'leths they set to work. I remember being sprayed with my CO's blood as they took his head off.
Yet on the planet's surface, the Klingons were not so restrained. Many Cardassian units, finding themselves surrounded by Klingon assault troops after leaving their bunkers, immediately surrendered. However, these Klingon troops, many of whom were raw and eager for combat, or veterans seeking vengeance, were not yet ready to accept their surrender.
I remember watching from a basement window, seeing our soldiers walk out into the street, waving white flags. We saw the Klingons come out to take the surrender. We all breathed a sigh of relief. There'd be no fighting here. But then the mood changed. The Klingons started shouting, and before any of us realized what was going on, the Klingons were cutting them to pieces. One of the soldiers tried to flee. He was gunned down, falling right from our basement window. I'll never forget the look on his face.
Many Cardassians fled at the sight of their officers being brutally cut down as they attempted to surrender, and soon word began to spread to other units that the Klingons were not taking surrenders. While some units resolved to hold out to the last man, most, realizing that no one was coming to their rescue, broke, the troops scattering and hiding among the civilian population. This fateful decision by terrified men and women would lead to a cascade of brutal violence not seen since the earliest days of the Klingon Empire. As more and more Klingon troops landed, eager to get to grips with the enemy, they were infuriated to find none, and so many company and platoon officers resolved to find the enemy no matter where they were hiding, and no matter whether they were armed or wore a uniform. These officers were emboldened to take such drastic action by the orders of the Chancellor himself, which were to capture Legate SoBrag and other Cardassian officers at any cost.
We were just having breakfast when we heard an almighty roar overhead. We looked outside to see Klingon shuttles landing. I couldn't understand where they'd come. Next thing I knew, they came bursting into our house and dragged us into the street. I remember seeing our neighbour Frayne struggling with the Klingons. I only knew him as a kindly old man. I never realised he was tough as old boots. They struggled for a while before another Klingon came along and stabbed him, leaving him to bleed out. They started dividing us up. I was left with my mother while they shoved my father and brother down an alleyway. That was the last time I saw them.
Yet some commanders were even more callous. Commander Drex in particular called in numerous fire missions on civilian dwellings, which he suspected of harbouring enemy soldiers, killing an estimated 700 people. However, the worst atrocities were carried out by the 5th Tongvei Assault Battalion on the settlement of Solana. There, the 11th Order's 2nd Reserve Brigade, knowing that they were doomed either way, put up a strong fight using the high ground of the town to beat back several Klingon assaults. Yet this show of resistance did nothing but infuriate these ill-disciplined Klingons. And so when they broke through, they began killing in a frenzy, not just surrendering troops, but the civilian residents as well. The elderly, women and children were put to the sword, suffering every brutality and cruelty at the hands of these rampaging Klingons. However, some officers in the battalion realized what was happening. Captain Marilla of Bravo Company's 2nd Platoon did what she could to alleviate the suffering.
My mother hid me and my sister in a closet. We could hear the screaming below. We heard someone kick the apartment door open. Then silence. A few seconds later, my mother opened the closet. She said it would all be fine now. I stepped out to see the towering stern figure of a Klingon woman. She beckoned me to go into the hallway where another was waiting. I looked at my mother. She nodded. Me and my sister went to leave, but the Klingon held out her arm. Neither of them made a sound. I think they understood, though at the time I didn't. I started to cry, and the Klingon in the hall took me by the hand and led me away. I remember hearing 2 gunshots a few seconds later. I was led out into the yard, where the rest of the children were. At the time, I thought we were being held prisoner. It was a few years before I realized that the guards weren't there to watch us.
Yet, not all Klingon women were as merciful. Major Kalissa of the 9th Kamara Infantry led her all-women detachment on a hunt for female Cardassian soldiers, butchering them in the most brutal fashion that they knew how, mutilating the bodies and putting them on display. This brutal frenzy of violence all occurred within just 12 hours. After the Klingon Expeditionary Force had finished mopping up the Cardassian fleet, they turned to secure the orbit of Septimus III, only to begin hearing reports of violence and a total breakdown of discipline. Brigadier Matau was the first to investigate, beaming down with a detachment of Marines into the city of Nankara. What he saw horrified him.
I've seen my fair share of battlefields. They are never a pretty sight. But never before or since have I seen a sight of such barbaric butchery, even for our own kind. I did what I could to take the bodies down, try and treat what was left of these women with some dignity. More than once the sight of the stench overcame me and I was sick. If these had been the bodies of an enemy warrior, I might not have been so overcome, but to see the mutilated remains of women and children, to know that this was done by our own blood, and to realize just how easily something like this can happen. That is perhaps the most sickening thing of all.
Acting quickly, he ordered the rest of his Marines to beam down and begin restoring order by whatever means necessary. He then sent an urgent request to General Martok. Martok had reported back to Deep Space Nine, eager to report the success of the initial assault to his allied partners. It was only at 0121 on the 15th of September that he received Matau's report. Moving quickly, Martok contacted Admiral Haftel, requesting that he send troops to Septimus III, although he did not state for what purpose. He then contacted Gowron to organise the withdrawal and confinement of the offending units. However, Gowron and his staff were slow to respond, arguing that as theatre commander, he should be responsible for the behaviour of his troops. This petty bickering among Klingon High Command only worsened the situation, sapping all momentum from the offensive. These tensions were further aggravated by the fact that Legate SoBrag was nowhere to be found. Later it was discovered that he had left just a few hours before the attack in a small transport shuttle, abandoning his troops to the Klingons and living to fight another day. While Admiral Haftel's Marines did help restore order and begin humanitarian relief efforts, they also brought with them embedded journalists whose first-hand accounts of Klingon war crimes would severely weaken public support for their Klingon allies and for the invasion of Cardassia as a whole.
What I found most disturbing wasn't so much the savagery and brutality that deep down we all knew the Klingons were perfectly capable of, but the indifferent disgust of our own personnel. Of course, as morally enlightened Federation citizens, they were also horrified and disgusted by these atrocious acts in and of themselves, but they also exhibited a disturbing indifference and apathy towards the actual victims. Very few seemed to have any pity for the Cardassian, even if they didn't say it in so many words.
As fortune would have it, their stories would be published far sooner than they had thought. On the 1st of October, the Breen Confederacy entered the war on the side of the Dominion, and their first task was to drive the Allies out of Cardassia, overrunning the Klingon Expeditionary Force and 19th Fleet at Septimus III, forcing them to retreat to Chinta and make their stand, leaving over 250,000 Klingon troops trapped on Septimus III. In many ways, the Breen offensive was a blessing in disguise. Not only was it a story that would overshadow the Klingon atrocities, but for those who were rightfully outraged, they could be consoled with the fact that the offending officers and men were now out of the fight, albeit as prisoners of the Dominion. Yet that is not the end of Septimus III's story. After the war, questions were raised regarding how Allied war criminals should be prosecuted. Some argued that they should face trial by a tribunal, much as the Dominion war criminals had. But ultimately it was decided that those responsible should be tried under Klingon law. Yet even then, political machinations continued to impede the course of justice. Many of the officers were children of the great houses, and Chancellor Martok granted many immunity or suspended sentences in order to gain political leverage. This enabled Chancellor Martok to push through numerous military reforms to further professionalize the Klingon defense forces, so that something like Septimus III would never happen again. Though this was small solace to the people of Septimus III. While we may never have an accurate number, it is estimated that over 150,000 Cardassian troops were killed, mostly unlawfully. It is estimated that a further 50,000 civilians were murdered, including an estimated 3,000 children, and it is believed that as many as 30,000 women were assaulted. Chancellor Martok believes that sufficient training and discipline will prevent such acts from taking place in the future. But of all the horrors of war, there is none greater than the darkness of our own hearts. Call on that darkness one too many times, and it may break loose and take one over.